Chapter 24, Part 2 of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Måns Bro, Helsingfors, Finland. Chapter 24, The Retreat and Death of Julian, Part 2. The martial impatience of Julian urged him to take the field in the beginning of the spring, and he dismissed with contempt and reproach the Senate of Antioch, who accompanied the emperor beyond the limits of their own territory, to which he was resolved never to return. After a laborious march of 2 days, he halted at the third at Berea or Aleppo, where he had the mortification of finding a Senate almost entirely Christian, who received with cold and formal demonstrations of respect the eloquent sermon of the apostle of paganism. The son of one of the most illustrious citizens of Berea, who had embraced, either from interest or conscience, the religion of the emperor, was disinherited by his angry parent. The father and the son were invited to the imperial table. Julian, placing himself between them, attempted without success to inculcate the lesson and example of toleration, supported, with affected calmness, the indiscreet zeal of the aged Christian, who seemed to forget the sentiments of nature and the duty of a subject, and at length, turning towards the afflicted youth, "Since you have lost a father," said he, "for my sake, it is incumbent on me to supply his place." The emperor was received in a manner much more agreeable to his wishes at Batne, a small town pleasantly seated in a grove of cypresses, about 20 miles from the city of Hierapolis. The solemn rites of sacrifice were decently prepared by the inhabitants of Batne, who seemed attached to the worship of their tutelar deities, Apollo and Jupiter. But the serious piety of Julian was offended by the tumult of their applause, and he too clearly discerned that the smoke which arose from their altars was the incense of flattery rather than of devotion. The ancient and magnificent temple which had sanctified for so many ages the city of Hierapolis no longer subsisted, and the consecrated wealth, which afforded a liberal maintenance to more than 300 priests, might hasten its downfall. Yet Julian enjoyed the satisfaction of embracing a philosopher and a friend, whose religious firmness had withstood the pressing and repeated solicitations of Constantius and Gallus, as often as those princes lodged at his house, in their passage through Hierapolis. In the hurry of military preparation, and the careless confidence of a familiar correspondence, the zeal of Julian appears to have been lively and uniform. He had now undertaken an important and difficult war, and the anxiety of the event rendered him still more attentive to observe and register the most trifling presages, from which, according to the rules of divination, any knowledge of futurity could be derived. He informed Libanus of his progress as far as Hierapolis by an elegant epistle, which displays the faculty of his genius, and his tender friendship for the sophist of Antioch. Hierapolis, situated almost on the banks of the Euphrates, had been appointed for the general rendezvous of the Roman troops, who immediately passed the great river on a bridge of boats, which was previously constructed. If the inclinations of Julian had been similar to those of his predecessor, he might have wasted this active and important season of the year in the circus of Samosata or in the churches of Edessa. But as the warlike emperor, instead of Constantius, had chosen Alexander for his model, he advanced without delay to Carrhae, a very ancient city of Mesopotamia, at a distance of 80 miles from Hierapolis. The temple of the moon attracted the devotion of Julian, but the halt of a few days was principally employed in completing the immense preparations of the Persian war. The secret of the expedition had hitherto remained in his own breast, but as Carrhae is the point of separation of the two great roads, he could no longer conceal whether it was his design to attack the dominions of Sapor on the side of the Tigris, or on that of the Euphrates. The emperor detached an army of 30,000 men under the command of his kinsman Procopius and of Sebastian, who had been Duke of Egypt. They were ordered to direct their march towards Nisibis, and to secure the frontier from the desultory incursions of the enemy before they attempted the passage of the Tigris. Their subsequent operations were left to the discretion of the generals, but Julian expected that after wasting with fire and sword the fertile districts of Media and Adiabene, they might arrive under the walls of Ctesiphon at the same time that he himself, advancing with equal steps along the banks of the Euphrates, should besiege the capital of the Persian monarchy. The success of this well-concerted plan depended, in a great measure, on the powerful and ready assistance of the king of Armenia, who, without exposing the safety of his own dominions, might detach an army of 4,000 horse and 20,000 foot to the assistance of the Romans. But the feeble Arsaces Tyrannus, king of Armenia, had degenerated still more shamefully than his father Chosroes from the manly virtues of the great Tiridates, and as the pusillanimous monarch was averse to any enterprise of danger and glory, he could disguise his timid indolence by the more decent excuses of religion and gratitude. He expressed a pious attachment to the memory of Constantius, from whose hands he had received in marriage Olympias, the daughter of the prefect Ablavius, and the alliance of a female, who had been educated as the destined wife of the Emperor Constans, exalted the dignity of a barbarian king. Tyrannus professed the Christian religion. He reigned over a nation of Christians, and he was restrained by every principle of conscience and interest from contributing to the victory which would consummate the ruin of the church. The alienated mind of Tyrannus was exasperated by the indiscretion of Julian, who treated the king of Armenia as his slave, and as the enemy of the gods. The haughty and threatening style of the imperial mandates awakened the secret indignations of a prince, who, in the humiliating state of dependence, was still conscious of his royal descent from the Arsacides, the lords of the East, and the rivals of the Roman power. The military dispositions of Julian were skilfully contrived to deceive the spies and to divert the attention of Sapor. The legions appeared to direct their march towards Nisibis and the Tigris. On a sudden they wheeled to the right, traversed the level and naked plain of Carrhae, and reached, on the third day, the banks of the Euphrates, where the strong town of Niseporium, or Callinicum, had been founded by the Macedonian kings. From thence the emperor pursued his march, above 90 miles, along the winding stream of the Euphrates, till at last, about 1 month after his departure from Antioch, he discovered the towers of Circesium, the extreme limit of the Roman dominions. The army of Julian, the most numerous that any of the Caesars had ever led against Persia, consisted of 65,000 effective and well-disciplined soldiers. The veteran bands of cavalry and infantry, of Romans and barbarians, had been selected from the different provinces, and a just preeminence of loyalty and valor was claimed by the hardy Gauls, who guarded the throne and person of their beloved prince. A formidable body of Scythian auxiliaries had been transported from another climate, and almost from another world, to invade a distant country, of whose name and situation they were ignorant. The love of rapine and war allured to the imperial standard several tribes of Saracens, or roving Arabs, whose service Julian had commanded, while he sternly refused the payment of their customary subsidies. The broad channel of the Euphrates was crowded by a fleet of 1,100 ships, destined to attend the motions and to satisfy the wants of the Roman army. The military strength of the fleet was composed of 50 armed galleys, and these were accompanied by an equal number of flat-bottomed boats, which might occasionally be connected into the form of temporary bridges. The rest of the ships, partly constructed of timber and partly covered with raw hides, were laden with an almost inexhaustible supply of arms and engines, of utensils and provisions. The vigilant humanity of Julian had embarked a very large magazine of vinegar and biscuit for the use of the soldiers, but he prohibited the indulgence of wine, and rigorously stopped a long string of superfluous camels that attempted to follow the rear of the army. The river Chaboras falls into the Euphrates at Circesium, and as soon as the trumpet gave the signal of march, the Romans passed the little stream which separated two mighty and hostile empires. The custom of ancient discipline required a military oration, and Julian embraced every opportunity of displaying his eloquence. He animated the impatient and attentive legions by the example of the inflexible courage and glorious triumph of their ancestors. He excited their resentment by a lively picture of the insolence of the Persians, and he exhorted them to imitate his firm resolution, either to extirpate that perfidious nation, or to devote his life in the cause of the republic. The eloquence of Julian was enforced by a donative of 130 pieces of silver to every soldier, and the bridge of the Chaboras was instantly cut away, to convince the troops that they must place their hopes of safety in the success of their arms. Yet the prudence of the emperor induced him to secure a remote frontier, perpetually exposed to the inroads of the hostile Arabs. A detachment of 4,000 men was left at Circesium, which completed, to the number of 10,000, the regular garrison of that important fortress. From the moment that the Romans entered the enemy's country, the country of an active and artful enemy, the order of march was disposed in 3 columns. The strength of the infantry, and consequently of the whole army, was placed in the centre, under the peculiar command of their master general Victor. On the right, the brave Nevitta led a column of several legions along the banks of the Euphrates, and almost always in sight of the fleet. The left flank of the army was protected by the column of cavalry. Hormisdas and Arintheus were appointed generals of the horse, and the singular adventures of Hormisdas are not undeserving of our notice. He was a Persian prince of the royal race of the Sassanids, who, in the troubles of the minority of Sapor, had escaped from prison to the hospitable court of the great Constantine. Hormisdas at first excited the compassion, and at length acquired the esteem of his new masters. His valor and fidelity raised him to the military honors of the Roman service, and though a Christian, he might indulge the secret satisfaction of convincing his ungrateful country that an oppressed subject may prove the most dangerous enemy. Such was the disposition of the 3 principal columns. The front and flanks of the army were covered by Lusinianus, with a flying detachment of 1,500 light-armed soldiers, whose active vigilance observed the most distant signs and conveyed the earliest notice of any hostile approach. Dagalaipus and Secundinus, Duke of Osrohene, conducted the troops of the rear guard. The baggage securely proceeded in the intervals of the columns, and the ranks, from a motive either of use or ostentation, were formed in such open order that the whole line of march extended almost 10 miles. The ordinary post of Julian was at the head of the centre column, but as he preferred the duties of a general to the state of a monarch, he rapidly moved, with a small escort of light cavalry, to the front, the rear, the flanks, wherever his presence could animate or protect the march of the Roman army. The country which they traversed from the Caboras to the cultivated lands of Assyria may be considered as a part of the desert of Arabia, a dry and barren waste, which could never be improved by the most powerful arts of human industry. Julian marched over the same ground which had been trod above 700 years before by the footsteps of the younger Cyrus, and which is described by one of the companions of his expedition, the sage and the heroic Xenophon. The country was a plain throughout, as even as the sea, and full of wormwood, and if any other kinds of shrubs or reeds grew there, they had all an aromatic smell, but no trees could be seen. Bustards and ostriches, antelopes and wild asses, appeared to be the only inhabitants of the desert, and the fatigues of the march were alleviated by the amusement of the chase. The loose sand of the desert was frequently raised by the wind into clouds of dust, and a great number of the soldiers of Julian, with their tents, were suddenly thrown to the ground by the violence of an unexpected hurricane. The sandy plains of Mesopotamia were abandoned to the antelopes and wild asses of the desert, but a variety of populous towns and villages were pleasantly situated on the banks of the Euphrates, and in the islands which are occasionally formed by that river. The city of Anna, or Anato, the actual residence of an Arabian emir, is composed of 2 long streets, which enclose, within a natural fortification, a small island in the midst, and 2 fruitful spots on either side of the Euphrates. The warlike inhabitants of Anato showed a disposition to stop the march of the Roman Empire, till they were diverted from such fatal presumption by the mild exhortations of Prince Hormisdas, and the approaching terrors of the fleet and army. They implored, and experienced, the clemency of Julian, who transplanted the people to an advantageous settlement near Chalcis in Syria, and admitted Puseus, the governor, to an honorable rank in his service and friendship. But the impregnable fortress of Tilutha could scorn the menace of a siege, and the emperor was obliged to content himself with an insulting promise, that when he had subdued the interior provinces of Persia, Tilutha would no longer refuse to grace the triumph of the emperor. The inhabitants of the open towns, unable to resist, and unwilling to yield, fled with precipitation, and their houses, filled with spoil and provisions, were occupied by the soldiers of Julian, who massacred, without remorse and without punishment, some defenceless women. During the march, the Surenas, or Persian general, and Malek Rodosaces, the renowned emir of the tribe of Gassan, incessantly hovered around the army. Every straggler was intercepted, every detachment was attacked, and the valiant Hormisdas escaped with some difficulty from their hands. But the barbarians were finally repulsed, the country became every day less favorable to the operations of cavalry, and when the Romans arrived at Maceprecta, they perceived the ruins of the wall, which had been constructed by the ancient kings of Assyria, to secure their dominions from the incursions of the Medes. These preliminaries of the expedition of Julian appear to have employed about 15 days, and we may compute near 300 miles from the fortress of Circesium to the wall of Maceprecta. The fertile province of Assyria, which stretched beyond the Tigris as far as the mountains of Media, extended about 400 miles from the ancient walls of Maceprecta to the territory of Basra, where the united streams of the Euphrates and Tigris discharged themselves into the Persian Gulf. The whole country might have claimed the peculiar name of Mesopotamia, as the two rivers, which are never more distant than 50, approach between Baghdad and Babylon within 25 miles of each other. A multitude of artificial canals, dug without much labor in a soft and yielding soil, connected the rivers, and intersected the plain of Assyria. The uses of these artificial canals were various and important. They served to discharge the superfluous waters from one river into the other, at the season of their respective inundations. Subdividing themselves into smaller and smaller branches, they refreshed the dry lands and supplied the deficiency of rain. They facilitated the intercourse of peace and commerce, and as the dams could be speedily broken down, they armed the despair of the Assyrians with the means of opposing a sudden deluge to the progress of an invading army. To the soil and climate of Assyria, nature had denied some of her choicest gifts, the vine, the olive, and the fig tree. But the food which supports the life of a man, and particularly wheat and barley, were produced with inexhaustible fertility, and the husbandman, who committed his seeds to the earth, was frequently rewarded with an increase of 2 or even of 300. The face of the country was interspersed with groves of innumerable palm trees, and the diligent natives celebrated, either in verse or prose, the 360 uses to which the trunk, the branches, the leaves, the juice, and the fruit were skilfully applied. Several manufactures, especially those of leather and linen, employed the industry of a numerous people, and afforded valuable materials for foreign trade, which appears, however, to have been conducted by the hands of strangers. Babylon had been converted into a royal park, but near the ruins of the ancient capital, new cities had successively arisen, and the populousness of the country was displayed in the multitude of towns and villages, which were built of bricks dried in the sun, and strongly cemented with bitumen, the natural and peculiar production of the Babylonian soil. While the successors of Cyrus reigned over Asia, the province of Syria alone maintained, during a third part of the year, the luxurious plenty of the table and household of the great king. 4 considerable villages were assigned for the subsistence of his Indian dogs. 800 stallions and 16,000 mares were constantly kept at the expense of the country for the royal stables, and as the daily tribute, which was paid to the satrap, amounted to 1 English bushel of silver, we may compute the annual revenue of Assyria at more than 1,200,000 pounds sterling. End of chapter 24, part 2. Recording by Måns Bro, Helsingfors, Finland.